Thanks for joining me for episode 3 of Scotpop. Before we get into this episode, I just want to say thanks to everyone who's been in touch and left a review or a comment on Spotify, YouTube, etc. I've got a few comments here, so I'll just read them out for a second and just to give a little shout out to people. The first one came from Richard. He said, "It's a musical history told with passion. Keep the episodes coming, Alan." I'll try. The second one came from Glenn. This is an interesting one. This came on Facebook. And he said, "Great podcast, mate. Been listening on Spotify. Hopefully you might have Stephen Lindsay of The Big Dish on there, as he's releasing a new solo album." I'm a bit of a fan of Stephen as well, because I remember the album Swimmer came out in 1986. And I'm sure, if I don't remember, I'm sure they may have supported Big Country that year as well. So yeah, that's a great shout. Thank you. The next one came from Paul Sampson. Paul said, "Hi Alan, great podcasts. Although I'm English, I live in East Anglia, I appreciate the input of Scottish music." So that was nice to hear. And the last one came from, the second last one came from Clive, who said, "I really enjoyed part 1, Alan." That's a piece with Ian Rankin. It brought about a lot of memories, which is nice to hear. And the last one, this is the last one. This one came from Sarah Jenkins, and she said, "I love the first part. I have subscribed." So thanks very much to everyone who sent those messages in. If you haven't sent a message in yet, it'd be really helpful if you did. It helps people find the show. So if you can, just a quick review or even a mention, it'd be really helpful. So today's guest is Douglas MacIntyre, who's possibly one of the most well-connected people in Scottish music today, particularly around the Glasgow area. And he's got an absolute fascinating story to tell. He's also very, very good company. If you watched last week's show or listened to it, you know he's also an author, and he's got a book out about his record label, Creeping Bent. He's played with the Bathers as a session musician, Love and Money, Lloyd, and he also played in the recently reformed Friends Again gig at the Old Fruit Market in Glasgow. He's also a producer, and he plays in his own bands. Article 58 was his first one in 1981, and he played in the Jazzeteers. This has taken him all over the world to play in shows, but he also promotes them as well. And he does a great little festival called Sandfest, which has raised more than £50,000 for Down Syndrome Scotland. Here's Douglas. So thanks very much for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to speaking to you. If I could just start, Douglas, a very simple question. Can you remember the first Scottish act you saw live and the impact it had on you?
Right, I can very clearly remember that. It was the sensational Alex Harvey band.
Wow.
At the Glasgow Apollo, and I think I was only 11. I was
really?
quite precocious when I was young, and as much as I think what happened was probably in 1973. Our family must have got a colour television.
Right.
And I get the old black and white television in my room, so I was about 11, and I started watching the Old Grey Whistle Test.
Right.
And very early on, I saw the sensational Alex Harvey band performing The Faith Healer and the title track Next. So I became a massive fan, and I got the album, and then I got their next album, which was The Impossible Dream. And I went to see them when they were touring that album. So I was there on my own. And
you actually went on your own?
Yeah, and we didn't have any buses, because I lived in Straven, and the buses didn't really go into Glasgow. You couldn't really get home. So my dad, after me badgering him considerably, he dropped me off. But it was totally old school. It was like, right, when this finishes, just come out, stand there, wait there, and I'll come and get you.
Can you remember what the show was like?
It was fantastic. It was very theatrical, and probably as a young sort of pre-teenager, I listened to Radio 1 was what I listened to, the charts, and so I liked everything from Lemmy and the Family Cooking to through to obviously Bowie and Roxy. That was pretty major. So things like I was a big David Bowie fan, and that, I suppose, Alex Harvey, I just kind of felt it was somehow related to Alice Cooper and David Bowie. The theatrical element of it really appealed to me. So their shows were incredible. I saw them quite a few times at the Apollo, each time going on my own.
And were you actually from a musical family then, Douglas? What's your kind of background? Because it's Straven, is it Straven? 'Cause I keep it, it's Strathaven, it's Strathaven as we call it, but it's Straven, isn't it?
It's Straven, yeah. No, not at all. My mum liked country and western and Sinatra, Glenn Campbell, that kind of thing. Right. So I remember those types of records being on, but Simon and Garfunkel, not really. And my dad wasn't really into music. He probably liked old traditional Scottish, Scottish songs. So I kind of knew them, but no, there was no musical element at all.
And so, where did music come from then? Because obviously we've got a lot to talk about. You know, you've got a book, you've got Article 58. I'm sure people know the single, the album's coming out. You've got all these things going on. But where did music start for you then? What was the kind of catalyst?
Very strange. It's I just always loved the radio.
Right.
So it really was as simple as Radio 1, and just hearing the charts, the chart rundown. And a fairly Catholic taste, which I still have to this day. And a lot of that was probably because, the charts were a mix of soul music. So a lot of soul, glam rock. You'd get bands like Deep Purple would have hits. So that whole thing really inspired me. I had an older cousin, Victor, who was really into bands like Free. Right. So I kind of really liked them. But that's like a kind of hazy memory of him being a babysitter and playing free,
right.
Records by Free, or bands like that.
Because it was quite tribal at that time, wasn't it? It wasn't. If you're either on one camp or the other, and that. Did you feel that as well, or were you kind of more eclectic?
Well, I was probably still at that point. I would still have been in primary school, so it was. I hadn't really found any, sort of music genre as being a sort of part of my identity. I just loved music. I loved the charts. I really had a wide taste as a kid, but it was I just kind of liked everything really. It was probably as I developed and started buying albums, which were primarily with Bowie albums and the Sensational Alex Harvey Band.
Right.
That's where I suppose I started discovering bands. This is all pre-punk, but I discovered bands like Bebop Deluxe. I was a big fan of them, but probably everything changed when when punk happened. It became more tribal then. It was definitely more tribal then. It was Stalinist. It was almost like all those records from the past, they're finished.
And what kind of impact did punk have on you then?
Massive, absolutely massive. It was I got punk straight away. I was an inveterate buyer of the music papers. So, at secondary school, I read them cover to cover, and I'd buy most of them, or I'd swap them with friends. So you would be very much, dictated to by what was, I suppose, hip in the music papers. And the thing about punk was, you could read about it before you could hear any of the records, because it was largely a London and music paper phenomenon. They started writing about the Pistols, but you couldn't hear the records because they hadn't really signed. But then when Anarchy in the UK came out, which I guess would be the tail end of 1976, I remember a friend bought it, and we went up to his house to hear this punk thing, which I'd kind of bought into the whole notion from the music press that it was unmusical. There was destroying music. But as soon as I heard it, I just thought, well, it sounds like the Spiders from Mars. Really. Yeah. I kind of assimilated it really quickly. Of course, the thing that was different about the Pistols was Rotten. He was incredible. To be that age and writing lyrics like that. And I kind of fell for all those bands, all the big bands, I suppose, like the Clash's first album, absolutely loved. the Buzzcocks' first album I loved, and the Pistols. But probably because I'd been listening to John Peel a lot over the years, and it was probably the stuff I'd heard on Peel that maybe didn't break big. Bands like the Subway Sect in particular, the Slits, the Prefect, a lot of those bands that Peel would have sessions by. They didn't have records out, but you could hear their sessions recorded for John Peel. They really kind of connected with me in a much bigger way, I'd have to say, than the Pistols or the Clash.
The whole Peel genre, then, was it something that you kind of bought into entirely? Were you sitting there listening on the radio in Stratham, and every session you could probably get a chance to listen to anyway? Were you that much of a fan then?
Yeah, I mean, I was meant to be upstairs doing my homework. I wasn't interested in doing homework, probably unfortunately, but from our parents. But no, I listened to Peel every night. Right. So it was kind of headphones, put the radio on and just listen to the radio. So in a way, John Peel's show almost supplanted listening to daytime radio when I was a pre-teen. As soon as I kind of got a wee bit older, I was just listening to Peel constantly, and he had a real mix. It was where I first heard dub, and that whole notion of dub reggae was really. That was the first music I couldn't understand, because I could understand the Pistols and the Clash. It was kind of like rock and roll, really. Mm-hmm. But dub was a whole new type of music, and I was fascinated by it. I absolutely loved that. And that would be Peel that you'd hear that on, and he'd also play like some pre-punk records by. I remember he used to always play a Matching Mole track with Robert Wyatt called "Old Caroline," which I absolutely love. You'd hear old blues records. So it fed into my eclectic love of different types of music, I suppose.
And how did you then go from kind of listening to music to starting your band? Because you started the band Article 58. You must have been a teenager. Can you just talk through that at all?
Yeah. We were. I think I was 16, and I'd started playing guitar, and learning songs from a David Bowie songbook, and I was playing in a band at school, where we would do cover versions of, a kind of really, again, because you're young and a bit stupid, we didn't realise that, you probably weren't meant to play all these different bands, so we would think nothing of playing, Stiff Little Fingers song, Mink DeVille, Thin Lizzy. It was all part of the same thing, so that was quite good in terms of learning how to play in a band at a kind of rudimentary level. But Article 58 was really kind of first band where we had a mission, and we were very, very inspired, obviously, by those some of those post-punk records, particularly the pop group. Actually, that was She Is Beyond Good and Evil was a big influence.
How did it actually develop then? Because was there a bit of a scene in Stratham? Because it's Lanarkshire, isn't it? It's kind of it's not known for its great contribution. But was there something going on, or was it just people? You just maybe 2 or 3 people in the village?
Yeah, I mean, at that point there wasn't really anything in that whole area. There was a great kind of punk band called Raw Deal, and that was Ken and David McCluskey, who would ultimately go on to be members of the Bluebells, and they were really good. They were like, I always felt they sounded like the Clash's first album. They were a kind of really exciting band. And there was a band called Lost Cause from Hamilton, and they used to do covers of alternative television songs, which I was a big fan. So it was actually the singer in Lost Cause, a chap called Jerry McLaughlin, who I thought he was pretty amazing. He had some, he was kind of like John Lydon meets Vic Goddard. It was kind of perfect for how I'd envisaged a band, starting. So I approached Jerry, and I didn't know him. I knew him through the very, very small kind of punk scene, I suppose, in that area. And he was up for doing something, and I had a friend at school who I'd grown up with, who was into good music as well. That's where I first heard Television's album. He was a big Television fan, so it was quite like the Paul Simonon thing where you're going, right, putting stickers on the bass. But he picked it up very, very quickly. He was a big Joy Division fan as well, so he kind of had that Peter Hook,
Right.
Unknown Pleasures kind of influence. So that's how Article 58 started. But we were very manifesto driven. It was like, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to try and do it. And it was the influence of, Subway Sect, alternative TV, that kind of thing.
Was it just that thing of like punk having a go type of thing where you kind of thought, let's just like why not type of thing rather than
absolutely. I mean, that was what was really great about that period. But I think in the immediate aftermath of it, the sort of post-punk period, it almost felt like every week there was a new single that was, breaking down barriers.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Cabaret Voltaire, who were effectively a primitive electronic band, and their single Nag Nag Nag. And we had a friend who lived in Hamilton who, I don't know if he had a part-time job, but he could afford to buy all the records every week. So we would always go down to his.
Well, he's in then.
he was the one that had the cash. So he would buy the new records every week, and you would hear, She's Beyond Good and Evil by the pop group. So we just go down there and play it again and again and again. And it was that fertile period where I guess the music papers were. They're pretty influential. I mean, writers like Paul Morley and Dave McCulloch, people could say that there were large elements of them that were pretentious, but it was really interesting because, I didn't get taught about Jean-Paul Sartre at school.
Yeah.
So if Morley's talking about that, you're like, what's that? Who's Albert Camus?
Yeah.
And so there was a real thing in the air where you wanted to, we were like sponges. We wanted to find out, who are these people? Why is Bowie going on about, William Burroughs? Who is William Burroughs? So there was that was always happening. And it was, I suppose now, it's quite educational because you certainly never get taught anything like that at school.
And then how did you actually record the single then? Because you recorded this thing, the Event to Come, the single from, is it Rational Records? Is that Alan Campbell, I think it is, isn't it, for the Joseph K manager?
Yeah. Well, I can't remember the exact timeline of what happened, but I think we'd done a demo and we sent a tape to like a few labels like Zoo Records, Factory, Fast Product, Rough Trade, Postcard, and Postcard got back saying, indicating that Malcolm Ross would be keen to come into the studio and help us record, and we were massive Joseph K fans, so that was great. And Malcolm was so generous with his time, and we were really excited to be working with him. And I think once we'd done that recording, Malcolm then played it to Alan Campbell, who was obviously Joseph K's manager, as you mentioned, and Alan asked if we wanted to release it as a single, which we did.
And I think Alan Horn was involved as well. I remember reading not
Alan,
so much the recording, but the kind of ideas behind the kind of single, I suppose.
Alan Horn,
which is very Alan Horn, obviously.
Well, Alan Horn came out we recorded the track in Straven. There was a studio in Straven where the first Orange Juice single was recorded, Falling and Laughing. So Alan came out with Malcolm and definitely contributed to the process.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of influence did he have then? Because he was always seen as like this kind of enigmatic figure, but nobody quite knew exactly what he was doing. But was he quite helpful? Was he quite generous with his time again, like Malcolm, or was he slightly more in the background?
It was very kind of him to offer to come out to Straven. So we were very, very lucky, and that was a very generous thing to do. I mean, in the studio, Alan Horn's not a musician, so. But you don't need to be a musician to produce a record. Mm-hmm. It's more about ideas, and he did have he did contribute a lot of ideas. I mean, it was predominantly Malcolm because we're a guitar band, you know, we were influenced by Joseph K, so
Right.
it was we're in the same ballpark. So Malcolm was really helpful and kind of guided us through the whole process of trying to make a record.
And how did that develop then, Douglas? How long was the Article 50 a kind of going concern for them? Because I think it was only the one single at that time. Because you did record an album, which obviously we'll come to later. Because obviously that's going to come out soon, so that's great symmetry. But how did it develop, and how long was the band actually going for?
The band started in the summer of 1980, and I think by the end of 1981 we were kind of falling apart a bit.
Right.
So it was a bit like, I think that whole period there were short, sharp bursts of energy.
Right.
It was very speedy, you know. It was like nobody was thinking about a career, you know, at all.
Yeah. Instinct.
You know, it was instinct, and it was like, you know, you do one record, it's like, well, what will we do now? And we were very lucky. We did some a short English tour supporting Joseph K when, to my mind, they were at their peak. It was just round about their second John Peel session, and when The Only Fun in Town had come out, had just been released. So they were on fire, and we were the best we'd ever been. You know, we probably should have continued and you know, made another record, but nothing was moving fast enough for me in particular. I was probably just trying to drive things too quickly. We should have made released more stuff, but we didn't.
Yeah. And so just looking at that, because if you think that's like 82 and you start Creeping Bent and what the kind of winter in 95, that period then, were you doing a lot of sessions then? Is that where you kind of joined bands like, I think, Love and Money, Lloyd Cole, The Bathers, etc.? Was that what happened after the end of Article 58?
Yeah, I'd kind of been in a few bands, and you know, and I'd signed some deals with majors and signed publishing deals, and it was, you know, it was good fun because I suppose I was in my early 20s, and you're getting a chance to go over to, you know, LA and New York, and it was quite exciting, but nothing was really, it was unsatisfactory from a musical point of view. And I think the last band that I was actually, you know, in a band, as it were, was the Jazzeteers, the last version of the Jazzeteers, and that, you know, at the end of that, I felt really drained by the prospect of being in a band. And then I'd get asked, I'd been friendly with friends again, just, you know, kind of knew them, and then so Chris Thompson was starting the Bathers, and he asked me to do some guitar in the studio, and James Grant, who was also in Friends again, asked me to do some live shows with Love and Money. So I kind of fell into doing session work, and I must admit I really enjoyed it, because it was a totally different discipline for me anyway, for being in a group, you know, where it feels like it's your own creative imprint is on it. Doing session work, there's an element of that, but there's also an element of this is what we're going to pay you to do. This is what we need you to do. And I actually really enjoyed that. I liked the discipline of having to, you know, to me it was like, you know, the equivalent of being an architect or a bricklayer or something. It's
right.
like
The actual craft of it,
yeah, the craft of it. Here's what we want you to do, and if you didn't do it to the satisfaction, obviously they would get somebody else. So I quite enjoyed doing that for a while, and it was lucrative financially, and obviously Article 50 wasn't lucrative financially. So I'd never ever really bothered about money, but I started making money doing session stuff, and it was good fun.
And I suppose then there comes a point then in your book, you know, A Leap into the Void, where you obviously decide. I think there's a great piece in the book when you mentioned I think you're in America and you're kind of driving around in this kind of fancy car, but you're obviously kind of, there's something burning away at you. What was the reason for starting Creeping Bent? Was it just that fact that you're just desperate to do something?
Yeah, I think there was definitely a desire to have a creative outlet, you know, that was my own, you know. and I was in LA, and I was on Zuma Beach. I'd been driving about Topanga Canyon and all these kind of Neil Young hotspots. So I was on Zuma Beach, and I just really decided. I'd been thinking about it, and I'd been listening while I was in LA. I'd been listening to some tracks, singles that had been released on Fast Product, which I was a massive fan of when they were released, but I hadn't really heard them, for a few years. And I started listening to the Fire Engines and Scars and all those records, and get really excited about the way Fast Product used to present their music, the packaging, the aesthetic behind it, and it felt like an art movement as opposed to a commercial record label. And I found that very inspiring, and I just felt that I wanted to try and do that. So that was the spark for starting Creeping Bent.
And then from there, because I remember reading the book, and this is where it gets a little bit strange, but I think when you started Creeping Bent, which would be around about kind of the winter '95, it was in Mount Florida. Is that correct? Was it Mount Florida? Because I actually lived in Mount Florida in '95 as well, in Battlefield Avenue.
Right. Well, we weren't far away from one another. We lived in Stanmore Road.
Right.
And so I had a house there, or a small flat there, and and I just started it was a typical bedroom label. We started it in there, and I did eventually take an office, but it was I bought a fax machine, which felt like the cutting edge of technology, and I had a fax machine in the bedroom, and that was it. That's when the label started.
When you start a label, you're obviously looking for bands. Did you have a few bands in mind, or did you think, well, I'll see what happens, or was there 3 or 4 you thought, right, I want those bands on Creeping Bent?
It was, again, a wee bit like Fast Product, where almost like the concept of having Creeping Bent was there before the notion of what artists I would work with. I wanted to have an artistic imprint, in much the same way as Fast Product did, through packaging, and that's kind of where my head was at. But I realised I would have to find or work with some artists. Probably the one artist that I did have in mind was the Leopards, which was Mick Slavin, who I'd known. He was in the Jazzateers and Bourgie, and Mick Slavin and Campbell Owens, who'd been in Aztec Camera, and Skip Reed. They were a kind of 3-piece band. At that time, they were playing in Paul Quinn and the Independent Group.
Right.
But the Leopards were very much like Richard Hell and the Voidoids, who I was a big fan of, and or Link Wray. Mick Slavin was really inspired by Link Wray. So I thought they were amazing, and I thought it would be really good to have an outlet for them. But I did release a single by them, but the first single I released was a band called Spacehopper, who I think I saw on the old 13th Note, and it was just, kind of like black noise. It was very visceral. Live, they were absolutely incredible. So it was a wee bit of a task to try and imagine how they could make a record that captured that mayhem. But I think we did manage to do it, actually. So that was the first band that I approached, and they were keen to do a record, and that's how we started off.
And then the next band that comes along, there was the Secret Goldfish, which I think is actually Katie, which is your wife. How did that develop? Because am I right in thinking Katie's brother's Stephen, who's married to Claire Grogan?
Yeah, so Stephen, I'd known Stephen. Stephen was the drummer in Article 58, and then he joined Restricted Code, who were signed to Bob Last, was managing them, and they were signed to Pop Oral, which was Bob Last's the label that Bob Last and Hilary Morrison started after Fast Product. And then Stephen worked at Fast Product as well, and then he was asked to join Altered Images, so he joined them for their third album, right? And I think with Stephen, he was always more interested in being a producer, so with Altered Images, he worked with Mike Chapman, who'd done all the big Blondie records, and also Tony Visconti. So that kind of really pushed him more towards being a producer. And I had the notion that Creeping Bent, it would be quite good to have one producer producing all the tracks. Yeah, very much so. And it didn't quite work out that way, but the first few tracks were produced by Stephen. So Katie, I'd known obviously just as being Stephen's sister, and she'd been in a band called Fizz Bombs, which were part of the whole Edinburgh C86 movement. And she was starting a band with Paul Turnbull, who was a drummer in a band called Mackenzie's, who were also on that NME C86 cassette. So, and I'd started going out with Katie, so it kind of just felt natural that I would be in the band as well. So that's how that kind of came together. Yeah, I really liked what the songs. I was a big fan of the Fizz Bombs, and the Secret Goldfish were almost like an extension of that type of, kind of really raw, unfocused pop music, really.
What were you kind of hoping to do? Was it sell loads of records, or was it just to try to put out some stuff that you enjoyed?
It wasn't to try and sell loads of records. However, I wasn't so naive that I recognised we'd have to sell enough records in order to make more records. And the big key for all of it, because although I'd been involved in bands and as a session musician, I'd done some production work for a really great Hamburg label called Marina Records. So I knew a wee bit about different elements of the music industry. I didn't know the first thing about starting a label. But what I did know was I needed to get distribution. I get your records in record shops, and I needed to have distribution by a company. So I contacted Rough Trade, and they asked me to come down to London to meet them, and they agreed to do the distribution for Creeping Bent. So that was a massive thing. They also agreed to do the manufacturing. So what that means in effect was they would pay up front for the manufacturing, and they would distribute the records, they would help me, and they would give me advice, which was much required. And we did like 4 singles in a row. So we manufactured the 4 singles, and we were ready to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and that was what my focus was. But we ended up getting NME Singles of the Week. Peel played all the records in the music papers, which you'll remember there were about 3 weekly papers at least, and they all did features on Spacehopper, The Secret Goldfish. We did a record with Alan Vega, Revolution.
Yeah, this is Frankie Teardrop, isn't it? Because I remember that because I was at NME at the time. That was that kind of got a lot of attention, didn't it? Because it's a great track, and it's a great remix. It's a great interpretation of it. Whose idea was that? Was that your idea, or just to kind of redo that?
I think it was. I think Stephen Laroni and I both thought it would be a good idea, because we were big fans of Suicide's first album in particular. And so Stephen made the record, which was largely sampling the original track, but it was more like a techno track. And we needed permission, obviously, to use the to use the sample. And so the person that, in fact, it was funny because I just got the fax machine, and one of the, if not the first fax I received was from a guy called Marty Thau from New York, and Marty Thau had managed the New York Dolls.
Oh, wow.
He managed Suicide, and he had a label called Red Star, so he released that first Suicide album. And Marty got in touch and said, I played it to Alan Vega and Marty Rev. They both absolutely love it, and we're really keen to do something. So we arranged this, we sorted out the deal, and that was all great. And shortly after that, Marty Thau faxed me again, and he was like, Alan Vega wants to join the revolutionary core of Teenage Jesus. So that was great. So Stephen and Alan then, started working on tracks over in New York, and That was quite magical, actually.
Yeah, I can imagine. Because am I right in thinking, I'm sure I read, I think it might actually be in your book I read it, but Stephen was one of the producers with the Dust Brothers on Mbop by Hanson. Was that correct?
Yeah, that was a wee bit. That was a wee bit later, and I mean that's kind of when he's as a producer, he get inundated with work, so he couldn't. That's when he stopped producing Creeping Bent records. Yeah, no, Johansson started Bop with the Dust Brothers, but it kind of didn't work out. So it was really pretty much Stephen that produced that single. So that was obvious. That was number one everywhere in the world, and so was the album. Back when you could sell records, so that's when he started as a producer.
And so just looking at Creeping Bent over 30 years then, what's the kind of highs and lows? Because there's a lot of great things in the book, you know what I mean, about particularly John Peel's kind of support and you're kind of getting media attention. But there's a story in there about a band called Bricolage, and I remember this. They were the kind of band that started and everybody was kind of talking about it, and then suddenly they just disappeared. Was that how difficult was it for you to kind of manage, you know, people's expectations of how many records they could sell or how good they were, and that is that a bit of a balancing act for you?
It's a wee bit, you know, but I just take the view that if you're honest with artists and have realistic expectations, which obviously not all artists have. But Bricolage, Creeping Bent managed Bricolage, so we released one single and it sold out in a day. And there was a lot of interest. Franz Ferdinand asked them to support them in a few shows. So immediately, without sounding blasé, it was really easy to get them a record deal because everybody was interested. I mean, the big independent labels and major labels were interested in signing Bricolage. We decided to sign with a label called Memphis Industries, who are a great label. They were having a lot of success with the Go Team, and they were great. So they recorded an album with Stephen Laroni producing it, and unfortunately the singer left the band the day the single got released. So that was kind of unfortunate for everybody else, and it was a great record, and I felt really sorry for them as a band, for the rest of the musicians. I also felt really sorry for Memphis Industries as a label. Usually you feel that you don't really have sympathies with big labels. I had nothing but sympathy for them. They were great guys, and they really put a lot of effort and energy and money behind the band, so that was a shame.
And just to kind of on a timeline way, Douglas, this is about 2008. Obviously, around this time as well, you're working with Mr. Davy Henderson. He becomes kind of very central to Creeping Bent. Is that fair to say that at that point? And you obviously, I think you actually take on the management of them at one point as well, don't you?
Yeah, I think after that initial announcement of Creeping Bent, which, the artist that we discussed earlier, probably the next wave was with a band called Adventures in Stereo. But then, in particular, we started working with the Nectarine Number 9 and Davy Henderson. And that was something that lasted still lasts just now, but it lasted right through the rest of Creeping Bent. So Davy was definitely a central figure in everything to do with Creeping Bent, I think.
Yeah, and then just to take it up to when Creeping Bent, the 30th anniversary, you obviously at some point kind of move into more live work as well. You take on it, and there's a great. I didn't actually realise this, but there's a little festival. Is it Sandfest?
Yeah, yeah.
You've got to tell us about James Grant doing Starman, because that just bursts out the book. I can imagine what it must be like. But how did that come about, and what was the kind of thinking behind Sandfest?
Well, Sandfest started. It was really just a party it was in World Down Syndrome Day is the 21st of March. Our third child, Matilda, has Down syndrome, so it was like a welcome, and we wanted to have a party to celebrate it. So we had a party in our back garden. It was a lovely day, and we had quite a lot of musicians were there, like who had been on Creeping Bent, like Davy Henderson was there, Sushil Kay Dade was there with their families and their children. So it was a great day. The guys from the Bluebells were there. Everybody, a lot of people connected with the label. And, we just did a wee bit of a jam with all the kids being involved. And Ken McCluskey, the very last song we did was, he did Young at Heart by the Bluebells. And at the end of that, he announced to everyone, we'll see you next year at Sandfest. What's he talking about? So that was how Sandfest was born. That was Ken kind of announced that, and we did it every year to raise money for Down Syndrome Scotland. And after 10 years, we used to do it in our small village hall, but on the 10th anniversary, we did it in the Royal Concert Hall. And we used to play in a small village hall, and just different people would come and perform, like Justin Curry from Telemetry and James Grant, and the Bluebells. We had a band every year called the Sandford City Rockers, which is pretty much guys from the Bluebells and Jazzeteers and me and a few others. And one year we did a kind of all the songs were Bowie songs, so. James Grant did Ziggy Stardust, followed by Starman, and I think he's been doing Starman ever since. It was fun, high camp extravaganza. It was brilliant. So they've been great. All of those musicians really supported Sandfest, and we did manage to. I don't know how much we've raised now, but it's definitely in excess of 50,000, which is great, and that's all due to the musicians putting all that time and energy into making it work.
And there's a lot kind of coming round in circles, isn't there? Because you've got the Article 58 album coming out on Creeping Bent. You've obviously done the book. You've played with friends again recently at the old Fruit Market. So do you think there's I think there's a lovely bit in your book as well when you say the kind of future is kind of made by the past, and do you still believe that?
Well, that was me, as usual, stealing someone else's idea. That was Alan Campbell. I always remember Alan Campbell from Rational Records saying to me, "You've got to always remember, Douglas, the future lies in the past." Right. And that always stuck with me. So that's why I was paraphrasing Alan. But it's funny how that just all, kind of comes around. It's hard to kind of none of that could possibly be planned. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact that Creeping Ben ended up working with I think it's mentioned in the book, the very first article that magazine article about Creeping Ben, they interviewed me and they asked me who my big influences were, and I was like, well, Subway Sect, the pop group, Fire Engine, Suicide, and we ended up working with four of the main people from all four of those bands. That was just serendipity. That that's in the lap of the gods. I don't know how that ever happened. It just kind of came together quite magically, and they were all really brilliant people, and it was great working with them all.
And just to kind of bring us to the end, and if you had to pick your favourite Scottish act, your favourite Scottish album, and a new band that you think we should be listening to just now.
Okay, well, two of them, I guess, are from that era where I was, I don't know, 18, and there was an Article 58, and we used to go and see bands all the time. So the Fire Engines, to me, were perfect as a band because it had a very short lifespan. It felt like it was all about art, but it crossed over into, the popularity. They were just really exciting. To me, they were the ultimate progression from what punk inspired. And they sounded a wee bit like some of the bands I like the Contortions and James Chance, but they just had something quite unique. I think their partnership with Bob Last and Hilary Morrison, and the way that they allowed themselves to be packaged by Bob and Hilary, is what made it quite magical, My favourite album would be The Only Fun in Town by Joseph Kay, which at the time got absolutely panned in the music papers. All their supporters turned on them. And I still think I loved it at the time. I couldn't understand why people didn't seem to appreciate it. But I think they were really, again, they just had a short time span, and it's just that forward drive. You probably just there's a forward drive and then it stops, and it just kind of, it's a bit like Article 58, as we were saying earlier on. It's it just kind of comes to an end, and you can't really kind of keep progressing. Um, Probably in terms of new bands or new groups or artists, I'm a big fan of my daughter's band, Quad 90.
Your birthday parties must be great, Douglas. Everybody's in a band and everybody knows somebody.
I know. It is a bit like that, actually. It is. So they're great. They're kind of it's Amelia Loroni and Naomi Mackay. So their whole approach is almost like the kind of Z Records, disco aesthetic, or the kind of punk funk type thing, I suppose, like Gareth Sega was doing back then. So I really think they're great. There's a couple other bands, the Chords, a fantastic band too. Again, they almost feel like they're harkening back a bit to the Fizz Bombs and Shop Assistants period, but they're putting their own imprint on it. They're great, I think. And there's an artist called Radhika, who, against the daughter of a former artist on Creeping Bent, Future Pilot, aka. And Radhika's made just the process of releasing an album. She's been working with, members of the Pastels and Jerry Love, and I think she's a real talent as well. So yeah, I think there's lots of exciting new music out there, but those three artists in particular, I think, are great.
And how would you look at Scottish music now? Then do you think it's in a healthy place? There's a lot of bands reforming, which has been great, but also those new bands as well. Do you think it's quite in Scottish music industry in quite a good place just now?
I think it is. I mean, I don't know. The industry part of it's always difficult, because if you look at the artists, I suppose, that are commercially successful, there's a lot of them. People like Lewis Capaldi, etc. That kind of music doesn't really move me in any way, but I think it's amazing that they're successful. I think it's brilliant what they're doing. So there's those kind of artists that have definitely become big mainstream artists, so that's good, because then that means there is money in the Scottish music industry to employ roadies, to employ studios. So you always need that, I think, to help generate finance. I think in the more kind of underground independent scene, it's always changing and moving, and I think there's a lot of great stuff. There's a lot of bands that have maybe been around for a wee while, like the Pastels, for example. And I saw the Pastels perform last year at this great festival called Glasgow's Pop, and they were absolutely brilliant. They were really amazing, really life-affirming experience. So,
and bands like Teenage Fan Club as well, another classic one.
The Fan Club are brilliant. Norman's doing great stuff as well in isolation with James Grant and Bernard Butler, and Jerry Love's doing. He's working on material, and it's great. So I think in all these different levels, and even when bands like the Bluebells and Friends Again, have come back, it feels quite a joyous thing. To me, it doesn't feel too much like, something tawdry about it. It feels really exciting, and I think pop music, for want of a better term, there was always this nonsense, hope I die before I get old, and rebellion of rock. It's a lot of rubbish, You wouldn't say that to Picasso or, to a playwright or to an author. I think your music, anybody any age can make music. I think that's a positive thing. And we went to see Katie and I went to see Edwyn Collins on his farewell tour last year, and it was absolutely brilliant, really amazing, and so I think from brand new bands right through to people like Edwyn, there's a lot of great great artists out there in Scotland.
Douglas MacIntyre, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Alan.
That's it for today's show. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks to Douglas for his time. It was great to have him on. Next week's show will be coming again. We'll be looking at, I'm not going to give it quite away just now, but we've got another really great guest lined up. And thanks again for listening, and thanks so much for the reviews and the comments. It really does help. If you haven't left one and you feel like it, it'd be great if you did. Cheers.